Okay, that was weird. It says something about somebody has to leave the meeting for it to start, and then John Howard left.
Oh, it was so weird. I had this ghost tab. Like I couldn't switch to it. I had the meeting going on. I don't know.
Huh. Okay, anyhow, without further ado, welcome to the Wednesday, August 30th Ambient Weekly Contributors Meeting. And so first up, we have Peace talking about waypoint policy.
Sure. Let me do the screen sharing thing. I should have had this all set up, but I got distracted. Let's see. It's a bit small. Let me
You can just go to, you see that 100% on the toolbar? Yeah, just upper left-hand corner says 100%. You can just click on that and make it like 125 or 150.
Nice.
Yeah.
Much appreciated. Yeah, so wanted to circle back around to the original waypoint policy target ref discussion. After last week, we got some feedback from a couple of folks who felt, well, just had some questions about the upgrade and migration story, as well as I think Zhang Hu, someone who, a maintainer who's not able to make this meeting because of the time zone, had some questions or concerns about the target ref in general. And so I wanted to just, reopen the original proposal and make sure that we've got at least some level of consensus that we still want to do this. Because a lot of the discussion and the conversation that's been happening is on just the API PR, adding the target ref to the API. And so I'm wanting to see a couple of things. One, do we still feel comfortable with the trade-off and the ramifications of adding target ref? And two, if we have alignment on that, can we move forward with the API PR and then have the follow-up discussions in the actual implementation of each resource? Because we have quite a few comments on the API PR itself already. Some people in particular whose feedback I'd love to hear would be some folks commenting in the PR, like Costin or Lynn or John or others who have ideas here.
I think the API is a PR. It's okay. I mean, we should have target ref in the API, even if we don't clearly know what the semantics are. I mean, I don't think it's better than not having it. How we define it and what attachment point is, that's a bit more problematic, but probably it's API by API where we need to define what is the granularity that we want to support and we can support.
I think I agree with that. I think there's going to be some variation from API to API on the specifics. Authorization policy, for example, has some issues with scoping when it comes to the layer targeting, which is a separate proposal. So yeah, I completely agree with that feedback. Anybody else? So if not, then I guess my question to the, I think, 3 TOC members in attendance today, which could be Lynn, John, and Mitch, is there anything outstanding on the API PR itself that you'd like to see before giving it one more review and approval so that we can move forward with the implementation?
I'll have to take another look to make sure things haven't changed since I last looked, but the idea was good to me. So I'll take another look at that today. But I think it should be fine. Are we like hiding this or somehow mentioning this is only for ambient or something, and to make this not directly to stable API to in some way?
It's hidden from docs.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's good.
John, on your comment, do we want it only for ambient, or is it something we want to do for gateways as well in both implementations? Because gateways are transcendent to the version.
Yeah, I wanted to do on gateways as well, but I don't want to shove this kind of large thing straight to GA.
Oh, no, of course,
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily that it was just for ambient. I didn't necessarily want that. I just want to make sure it wasn't GA, basically. So.
And to clarify, that there's a lot of discussion on the PR. For right now, we are scoping it to ambient only because there's some questions about client side application, especially on a per resource basis, and how client side overrides and such might work in the context of Gateway API and parity. And so because the blocker was like the reason we are doing this is for ambient, then we kind of we're trying to just get the ambient pieces done and move those forward, and not have to tangle 100% with Gateway.
I'm curious if John wants to say the same thing as I want, so John, go first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with if we would need to scope it to make it easier, but the concerns don't make sense to me. I mean, it's syntax sugar for a workload selector, so it doesn't, it can't be wrong, kind of, in some ways. Like, yeah, there's details about what happens if you have a workload selector as well, and like there's details we need to work out, but to say like client overrides, that to me, maybe I'm just missing it, but it doesn't seem to make sense, especially since on gateways, by definition, there's no client override. So like I said, like it's fine to scope it to ambient, but we should do a fast follow to expand it, I think, probably.
Yeah, I want to say kind of the opposite. It will be super strange to have the target ref, which is introduced by the Kubernetes Gateway API, apply to anything but the gateway. To say, okay, gateways that defines the API target ref, it doesn't apply to them, but it applies to something else that doesn't have anything to do with gateways. Which is
well, Waypoint is also gateways. It's just
it is in some meeting and it is not in other meeting, John. I mean, let's pick Pikachu's aside. I mean,
well, it is literally using the gateway object. It is not literally identical to the Istio gateway class or interchangeable with other gateway classes. It is a special gateway class that has different semantics.
Can I define listeners, attached routes, and so forth?
No.
Okay, so it is a gateway class, but it's not.
It's a very limited gateway class.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I mean,
which, yeah, I mean, I think we will support that eventually. But.
My point is it should be a priority to support gateway first, because gateway is the ones that defines target ref. I mean, everything else will be super confusing. Sorry, Lynn, go your turn.
Okay, if you guys are done with that particular point, I just want to walk through the migration scenario. The only thing I'm not too comfortable, I think I shared with Keith last time, is the migration scenario, just making sure, you know, we have a path for people using Sidecar today to be able to migrate to ambient using this particular policy with target ref. So in my mind, I'm thinking through, let's say I have sleep cause HTTP bean, right? The most simple Istio scenario. And let's say I have HTTP bean, maybe I have multiple replicas, right? And I'm using Sidecar today. Now I'm explore ambient. I would expect I would probably stand HTTP being in ambient as well, right? So I probably would have Sidecar and ambient coexist and transition and maybe gradually shift traffic to ambient if the test passing. So let's say I'm using a simple policy. I know your PR covers multiple. It's just using authorization policy as an example, right? So I set up an authorization policy on my HTTP bean that has certain rules. And my authorization policy was for sidecar today, right? Because I come from the world of sidecar. So I'm probably using a workload selector. I'm selecting app HTTP bean. Now that I also have HTTP bean some of the replica or maybe another deployment of HTTP in canary deployment in ambient. So now I'm also needing to create another authorization policy, I assume. And in that new authorization policy, I expect I would using the same like rules and condition. The only difference would be instead of using workload selector, I would using the target ref to bind to the waypoint for my HTTP, assuming I also have a waypoint, right? Because that has to be there. Is this the flow of migration we are expecting? So in other words, during this transition period, we would have both authorization policy coexist where the old authorization policy would apply to enforced on the sidecar and the new authorization policy would be enforced on HTTP's waypoint with specific target ref as the semantics.
So I want to make sure that we are aligned on the kind of the goals for beta. I think we make the sidecar to the heterogeneous proxy topology out of scope for beta, right?
I understand that, yeah, but I'm just because we're just talking about API design, right? So I just want to make sure we don't foresee issues with that approach that we would require us to change in the API again.
Well, so I don't think there's an issue because if you're moving from from sidecar to ambient, you're going to your current stuff is selecting the workload. You're going to have to change that policy to select the waypoint anyway. Is that not correct?
Yeah,
that
that's
is
correct.
correct.
Lynn. This is purely
Okay.
a surface level syntax difference. You either put a label selector that references a gateway object, or you put a target ref. But it's the same thing. It's just like you could directly translate to and from them. They're 100% identical. It's just whether you type name or a label that represents the name.
Yeah, that is correct. I guess what I'm trying to work through in my head is now I have to duplicate my policies, right? So basically,
you always had to do that, though. This is not changing that at all. This is what we changed a couple of releases back when we decided that policy is attached to the waypoint instead of pods. But it's not changed here at all, right?
But for other policies, I don't have to duplicate my policy, right? If I'm using like a route configuration or destination rule, I don't have to make a copy as I move from sidecar to ambient, just this ones.
No, all the workload selector ones, yeah. Routes
Yes.
and destination rule are kind of unique in Istio. All the other ones kind of follow the same semantics of finding to a workload.
Yeah, that's what I want to work through. So that's scenario number one. I think if we educate user, it's probably okay. It's a little bit painful, but at least there is a path for that. I think scenario number two would be how would we alert user when the configuration mismatching? Would we be able to detect, hey, you are using workload selector, but now you have a waypoint. Maybe you should switch to use target ref. I'm just thinking loud here, without any pre-thinking. Because I think it could be a little bit error prone from a user perspective, where they might have the target ref, which they should have workload selector, or maybe they have workload selector, but it should be the target ref. Depends on which deployment model they have.
Is this a good use case for an analyzer to sort of see how they're using waypoints versus traditional gateways and provide feedback on their policies?
Yes, if analyzer can detect such a thing, I think it would be really good to analyze. The only tricky thing is the analyzer needs to not only look at the YAML, it needs to consider the data plane topology that the YAML is applying to. So it has to be a little bit more intelligent than our analyzer today, I think.
Yeah.
So so it sounds like most of the questions are around, or most of the concerns around the change in in policy application from pods to waypoints. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, and I don't think I have a better solution than what you propose. I just want to make sure we as a team, thought about these. That's all.
Yep. Okay, so if that's the feedback, then I think it sounds like we can move forward with this PR. There are other PRs that are being staged on the implementation, so we can move pretty quickly after that. As far as the gateway piece, I'm trying to go back and find the feedback that caused us to kind of back up from Gateway API Ingress gateways, but I can't find it at the moment. Does anybody who was involved in the PR happen to remember?
I don't. Let me dig into it. I'll look.
Is that the PR to change the way we bind to the gateway to use target ref as well?
I found the comment. Here we go. Yes, so for Gateway API gateway specifically, this target ref should also be applicable. Do you want to support this for policy targeting a resource in a different namespace versus putting the policy in the namespace? Yes, and so the question was around where does the policy live in reference to the gateway, which is the namespace. Today, for Gateway API gateways, your policies it's still workload targeted. Your policies are still workload targeted, right? You don't select we don't have that workload to gateway policy attachment change that we do in Ambient for regular Gateway API. And so that was why we kind of removed gateways, like Ingress gateways, from the scope of it, because that's a separate change that is going to break users who aren't moving to Ambient. I remember now. Does anybody have opinions on that? I know, John, you were pretty, John and Costin, you both had some opinions about it not applying, the policy attachment not applying to Ingress gateways.
The issue is that the Isio legacy gateway doesn't actually represent a workload. So, and it's not namespace bound. So it totally destroys any attachment like this.
Well, I'm talking about Gateway API gateway specifically. I'm not sure if you are or not.
Oh, I'm totally fine with it applying to normal, to not just waypoints. Like I said, I'm fine with if we have to do it to waypoints just to avoid confusion, but there's no reason in my mind to limit it.
But there is a reason, I think, is because similar to what Lynn was talking about before, in Ambient, we made the move to have policies apply from workloads to gateways. We haven't done that. In my understanding, we haven't done that for Gateway API gateways.
No, it is. It is. You still apply them to the gateway workload. Like, how do you apply an authorization policy to an Ingress gateway with the Gateway API? It's exactly the same as Ambient today. You do a label selector, and we've said the only supported label to select on is the gateway name label, which is identical to referencing it by target.
Okay, gotcha. I wasn't clear on that.
Would it avoid the confusion if we define a new class of gateway, let's say Istio, gateway, modern, ambient, or whatever we want to call it, which would have the semantics that only target ref applies and it's super compliant to the gateway, and maybe we make different choices about the API surface. So basically, we leave the old gateways alone, and there is no confusion. We keep selector what you. I think that's what you want it to, not touch the gateways, but we define a new gateway class where we do apply them, and if someone is using the gateway class, it will be the kind of the correct behavior always. And I don't know, just throwing an idea to find a common ground.
I'm not necessarily, I don't think we necessarily need a whole new class. It would be nice to essentially have users be able to opt into, well, I don't even know how you opt in. Well, you set the gateway class and create the gateway. It would be nice to have users to be able to opt into the gateway API behavior in a very explicit way. But I'm not.
What is more explicit? What is more explicit than a gateway class? I mean, which is a standard way to define a category of gateway implementations. That
It's not wrong. What I'm worried about is eventually having to remove that gateway class, and we want that to become the default. But yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that a little bit more. Lynn, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to understand what the advantage is to support target ref in this scenario, because from pods to waypoint, right, we didn't have a choice, right, because the label on the pods HTTP being is different than the waypoint. So we're essentially bring a lot of complexity to the user to say, hey, you actually have to replicate your authorization policy as you move from sidecar to ambient. You have to kind of make a duplicate, and you have to manually change the target ref instead of using workload selector. But for gateway, wouldn't that be the same label? I mean, what would be the advantage to support this target ref other than having user doing more work?
So one, I would argue it's not more work. In one case, you have to match on a magic label, and in the other case, you match on a very explicit, well-defined API. And in one case, you're saying magic label equals my gateway, and the other you say name is my gateway. So it's the same amount of work, but it's much more structured. And the structure is defined by the Kubernetes Gateway API, where every vendor API policy attachment follows the same structure, and they have tooling around understanding these attachments and et cetera, and documentation. So we have consistent ecosystem. The other thing it does that's really important is that today you create the gateway API, and under the hood, we spin up pods, right? But that's kind of an implementation detail. From a user perspective, they only interact with the gateway. And if they're moving from a different gateway implementation, like AWS implementation, there's not going to be a pod in the cluster, right? So by having attachments go to the actual gateway, we avoid leaking the internal details, and we have them actually attached to the thing that they create, right? It's like in Kubernetes, you don't attach something to like a low-level internal resource like an endpoint or something, right? You attach it to the higher level resources, and sure, they create internal junk behind the scenes, but that's internal detail that you don't need to worry about. And in fact, you may not even have a pod in some implementations of Istio, whether that's a vendor modification or some future changes we made. For example, I had a prototype in the past where you created a gateway in Istio, and it spun up a pod, but the pod was actually in a completely different cluster, and it was totally like kind of managed. And that could have easily been running on some serverless compute, or not even in Kubernetes at all, running on some VM or whatnot, right? So it helps us preserve the separation between the actual user intent and the implementation. And it's just as easy, if not easier.
Okay, so I think I understand the purpose of it. I would argue, probably continue to preserve the workload selector semantics is also valuable for users who are using them today, and particularly who are, using them, migrate from sidecar to this new word, allows them, and they can migrate off workload selector if they choose to, and move to target ref. It works better, but it gives them the transition period without creating like duplicate resources.
I'm not sure what you're talking about with sidecars. This is about gateways. It's unrelated to sidecars. And by the way, the attachment currently is described as experimental. So, I mean, I'm fine. I'm not saying we should delete it right away or anything, but it's not like this is something that's been around for 10 years and everyone has their label selector policies. This is a new thing, the Gateway API, and it's explicitly called out that attaching resources is experimental. And the reason we kept that experimental is exactly to do this transition to parent ref or target ref.
Okay, so I think I was confusing a couple of things. Let me just clarify. So we're not talking about Istio's gateway resource. That will stay as workload selector, right? Everybody agree with that. We're talking about Istio's new implementation for Kubernetes Gateway API right now. It has attachments through workload selector, but we're thinking about changing that to the target ref. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Okay, yeah, I think I feel better now.
Okay, great. If that's the case, then I'll chat with Jackie about adding Gateway back into scope with those clarifications. I think it makes a lot of sense since we already have prior art. I do think we should kind of summarize in the chat. I think we should also try to highlight the shift for gateway attachment, maybe a bit more prominently, or if not prominent, maybe more something more relevant to users on the docs page, and you can tackle that. But okay, sounds like there aren't any blockers here, so appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peace, for driving this. I know a lot of
Yeah.
debates. We're just trying to do what's the best for the project.
Yeah, this was a tough one. Thanks. I mean, you picked up on my work and I stopped it because it was too hard. So I'm very appreciative of that.
It's not just me. It's lots of folks on
Yes,
in
that's
the
true.
community working on
Thanks
it.
all.
So appreciate everybody's effort. Okay, John, you've got the next topic.
Yeah. Oh, cool. You're opening it for me.
Yep.
I don't know why I muted myself. Yeah, I just want to go over this blog post so I get some more ad revenue. No, just kidding. Not necessarily because we should do this or not, but I think it's like I wrote it for myself to understand Istio a bit more, and it helped me a lot. So maybe it will help others. And it will certainly probably help understand Costin's perspective more. At least for me, it did. And I agree with it quite a bit more than I did in the past. So basically what this is exploring is today we have this waypoint gateway class, and it does all this magic when you apply it, right? You just apply the gateway and all of a sudden everything's changed. All the traffic goes through the waypoint. We accept traffic to services. We accept traffic to pods. You can use service-bound routes, and we apply the routes there. It's all this kind of magic that happens with a very small action of just creating that 5-line gateway object. So what I was exploring is, what if we wanted to do something like waypoints, but without using the waypoint, and even potentially without Istio? Like, what if we wanted a waypoints with I don't know, Nginx gateway or Google load balancer gateway or whatever? And that's basically what this is. I happen to use Istio because I don't like other products because I'm not used to them and it annoys me. But it's just using the standard Istio gateway, so it's not using any secret sauce. So if you scroll down a bit, basically what I've done is just deployed standard Istio with normal gateway, some test applications. Nothing interesting here. These are just completely standard applications. And then some test client, and then we can see we can obviously connect from the client directly to server. No secret sauce at all. No L7 proxy or anything, right? That's just kind of the baseline. Now, if we want to add some L7 thing, we can just deploy a gateway. And this is 100% a standard gateway, just like you would write for ingress traffic. The only difference is we mark it as a cluster IP instead of load balancer. Technically, it could be load balancer, but you probably don't want to expose it externally. And that's it. And I can call it just like I did before. It's a little bit awkward because I don't have DNS set up, but I will, that's later in the doc. And now my request goes through the gateway. So I have kind of an internal load balancer to the Echo service. But I can still go to the normal service if I wanted to. So like all these call paths are kind of valid here on this somewhat confusing grid of things. This part is kind of just notes almost on how to set up external DNS, but the real gist of it is that if you do this setup, then the config before automatically sets up DNS as well. So now I can just call echo.mesh.howardjohn.net or whatever domain name you use instead of the .cluster.local address. And yeah, so the next big thing that's different from a waypoint is with waypoints, we enforce the traffic actually goes through there, right? So we can do something similar if we just use network policy. This blocks all traffic other than that from the gateway. And then now the graph looks like this. It looks a lot more like the waypoint topology. One thing that's very different is that in waypoints today, we do, well, there's a lot of contention around this, but we potentially do the hairpinning if a client doesn't go through the gateway, right? This does not do that, and there's not really a feasible way without either some really smart CNI that I don't know of or Istio waypoint to retain that behavior. So then the alternative is if you do it with waypoint, it's very similar. Like the main difference here is you create a route and you bind it to the service itself. We're modifying the actual service instead of just attaching a route to the gateway. And then we did deploy a gateway, and I just used the Istio title command, but it's basically a very similar thing. So we end up, again, with a practically identical diagram of before. That's about it. There's a few differences here. So it's a bit awkward to use a non-HTTP protocol for this case. Like with TCP on a gateway matching, you really only have like port matching because we don't have additional destination IP. Like the destination IP for a standard gateway is always the gateway's own IP address, so you can't really get value out of that. Whereas with the waypoint setup, we have two IPs really. Like obviously the gateway gets a request, but inside of it, it's tunneled, so we have the intended original service destination. And then obviously one big difference is whether we modify the service or we make kind of a new service that has the L7 behavior. There's also automatic transport encryption with the waypoint, but we'll add that to the DIY one in the next section. And currently it's, I mean, it could foresee a way that we could add it, but there's not a clear path to having kind of client-aware policies in the gateway. Even once we add the transport encryption in the next step, we're still not going to be able to really reliably know who the client was and apply like authorization policies to that. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
I was curious. I mean, this is all interesting. I maybe missed were you suggesting something in presenting this, like that this is a different model that we should be using? I wasn't quite sure what the context was beyond like, oh, you could do it other ways.
Part of the context was that I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is what Costin thinks that we should do. And right. I didn't fully understand it, and it led to some confusion, at least for me, in discussions. So at the very least, this will help understand, it helped me understand what Costin was talking about by actually trying it instead of just saying, no, that's not what a waypoint is. And now I do actually think that there's valuable things here. I'm not saying that we necessarily should go all in on this approach. I haven't decided for myself personally what I think we should do yet. I'm still kind of exploring, but I am starting to kind of rethink some things a bit. Yeah, go ahead, Costin.
Yeah, and what, well, actually that's an internal document. I'm working on a public version as well. My point is that whatever it is in this document is already possible with any class of gateway and with any vendor. So it's not something that we decide to do or not to do. It's something that is designed by the gateway, API, and it works and provides the same capabilities, except that for plain text or non-Istio clients, if you have a non-Istio client, there is a major difference. I mean, in our case, we go to pod, and then we hairpin back and forth to the waypoints, so 2 round trips, and we don't get jot and whatever. With this solution, you make a small change in the config. You use a friendly name, I mean, example.com or whatever, which is nice for some customers. And some people prefer to use cluster local. Some people consider it's friendly to use their domain name. But you go straight to the gateway, so you save 1 round trip, and you can use jot and all the power of the gateway explicitly. Pick your implementation of gateway if you want. I mean, it's not you're not stuck with only Istio APIs. You can pick up, I don't know, whatever you want.
So would the suggestion here be that we instantiate waypoints in a different method? Like, how does this? Okay, so
it doesn't have anything to do with waypoint. It's just saying that, hey, you can use waypoint. It's wonderful. It works perfectly. It has a lot of benefits if that's what you want. Or if you choose to, you can use a different gateway. No problem. Which may have other features, may have other behaviors, may support different set of features, different authenticate, whatever you want.
Okay.
And that gateway is perfectly valid, and it's perfectly fine to use it. I mean, there is nothing wrong with using a gateway. I mean, that's what it's designed for.
Okay. And then the lack of hairpinning or required going through the gateway seems like a pretty big deal to me in terms of enforcement.
Why? That's what John had.
Well, you can enforce it, Justin. You just can't hairpin it.
Okay, so you can require that they can't go directly to the clients.
Yeah.
Not only that, you can specify everyone is denied. Nobody can go otherwise than through the gateway. But you can say this particular workload that I trust because it's the same namespace, same user, and it's co-located. It can go directly because again, you can have 2 microservices from the same owner. You just divide them to pods. You co-locate them and you trust everything.
Yeah, or say like this port, like my HTTP port, you need to go through the front door, and my TCP port, that's fine, come direct.
Okay.
Like it's just a network policy, so you can customize it to your desire.
Okay.
Let me finish up. There's just one more section,
Sorry.
and then I have some more to answer to your question, Justin. But just to make sure I don't jump ahead. The other thing, one of the big gaps, we had no encryption. Turns out we have a pretty good encryption thing that's ZTunnel, and we can use that here, right? So if we just make the client and server in the mesh, like we don't actually deploy waypoints, we just have ZTunnel here. And then I work around what I think is a bug that I will look into in the future with this disable HPhone. Now we can do basically the exact same thing, but it's encrypted, and it's hard to tell it's encrypted because we made ZTunnel transparent, but we do have this nice Kiali thing, and it shows this. You may notice it actually doesn't show any traffic to echo v2, and that's a bug in our telemetry, which I found during writing this. So we can discuss that maybe separate. And we can even, if you scroll down a bit, if we don't like network policy, now we could use authorization policy, which is basically the same, but slightly different. And we can use identities instead of labels if we want. So yeah, that's it. Going back to Justin's question, like some of the context is we made a ton of decisions in Ambient, and almost everywhere along the way, we decided to reinvent things, right? We have huge competition with the CNI because we basically reinvent everything the CNI does except for IPAM, right? We handle services, we handle telemetry, we handle, I forget other things. There's more. We do everything, right? Like the CNI is basically useless. And a lot of that, I think, is because we built it on top of CNIs that don't provide a lot of functionality. But a lot of CNIs do provide a lot of functionality, right? Like we have this awkward overlap where we try and run the entire world. And, we say, this is what a service is. We're going to change that meaning. We do all these things. And that leads to a lot of complexity. I think it leads to, I don't know. That's kind of the kernel of what I've been thinking about for the past few days or weeks or whatever. I don't have a conclusion yet necessarily, but I've been kind of thinking like, what if we went the opposite approach and tried to reuse the underlying platform as much as we could, and we just add kind of little tweaks here and there to provide things we need. You know, like what if we didn't do certificate management and we let Cert Manager do that? What if we didn't do service load balancing and whatnot and let the CNI do that? And okay, maybe the CNIs don't have the encryption we need, but we can add that in a much lighter weight way, kind of after all the CNI stuff, instead of hijacking the earliest possible point. And like waypoints, like we reinvented a new waypoint. Like what if we just use a normal gateway? It could be an Istio gateway because we have that, but it could be Nginx or whatever. So that's what I've been kind of looking into and thinking through.
Yeah. So it seems then like, and I know we've had some side conversations about this as well, that then actually this is sort of saying that Ambient is a pattern. There is a reference implementation that we've talked about with ZTunnel and with waypoint proxies, but there are probably other ways that you could implement this without using those components, still get a lot of the same APIs, but then you could have alternate implementations. Is that a fair summary of what?
I would say yes, a lot of the same APIs and experience, but not necessarily 100% identical APIs and experience.
But
basically, like we first did the most maximalist approach of reinventing everything, and so part of that was for good reasons. Part of that was because that's easy to do in open source because it's hard to make assumptions about their platform because we want to run everywhere on every system and they're all different. And part of it was because we evolved Ambient very slowly. Like the initial versions of Ambient literally took the sidecar as is and just stuck it in a pod, like it was a side pod, right? It was a sidecar. It was exactly the same config. And we slowly like chipped away to where we got at Ambient. So it's very natural to keep the old world of sidecars where we did the same thing and just kind of reinvented everything. Now, the other approach I was going is like, what if we did the totally minimalist approach? Like we do the least amount possible. And it turns out there's very, very little to actually do. It's mostly just adding MTLS, almost as like a last mile encryption thing. Now, what we do for real is probably somewhere in between those, or maybe we have some options or something, but that's kind of where I'm at yet. I haven't got a conclusion yet, only some more data.
Cool, thanks.
Hey, two sort of thoughts on this. One is there an inclination or a sort of aspirational thought that the L7 proxy will be plugin replaceable at some point and Waypoint is just one sample implementation, but this entire architecture works in the future with your own flavor of Waypoint instead of what we give? Like, is it supposed to be plugin replaceable at some point?
I would say that in the current design, it's more of a hypothetically possible to replace. In this design here, it is, you can already do it, right? I used Istio. I probably shouldn't have used Istio, but I'm lazy and I didn't want to learn how to deploy Nginx. But I could have easily used Nginx or any other gateway, right? It's 100% standard gateway here. So the answer is maybe.
Well, 100% standard, any implementation of the gateway API in particular. Otherwise, you would have to have a new API for.
Yeah, any implementation of gateway API, but everything is implementing it nowadays. I mean, in theory, you could have done this with Ingress or Nginx custom API. Like, it doesn't really matter.
So if I can jump in, John, there is one point here that is, I want to make sure it's not lost. It is 100% possible today with almost any implementation of gateway, as long as user is willing to make the config change to use friendly names instead of cluster local. The only thing that is not possible is to preserve the cluster local semantics. So if the user is changing to example, echo.example.com, then today you can do that well, that's a demo. That's what John is showing here, that it is possible. So there is nothing. I'm pretty sure he can swap Nginx with
Yeah, but we haven't made anyway a statement saying the intent, like you will be conformant with any implementation of gateway. It's not very explicitly stated.
It is implicitly. I mean, we are saying that ZTunnel provides security, and obviously it does. And we are saying that a gateway can be used for routing or whatever you want. I mean,
but not everything. I mean, like there are things that are still being defined, like L7 authorization policies that would not be supported by this, Correct.
They will be supported because a gateway implementation may or may not have a particular, I mean, if you use, for example, a Google Gateway instead of Istio Gateway, you'll have the IAM policies that Google provides. If you use Amazon, you'll have whatever authorization policy Amazon provides. So for
I guess I was more making the statement that like I think it's a little oversimplifying to say that any gateway, anyone that supports the gateway API can do what we're doing, which I think is not entirely true. It has to support other things as well. Not, like just being gateway compliant is not sufficient to have.
Like you don't get exactly what Istio gets, but you get the things that that gateway provides, which is
yes.
There's the core, which everyone has, Gateway API core. That's routing. Everyone has that, and there'll be more core. And then whatever extensions they have. So in Istio, we have our extensions. Another thing, they'll have their extensions. Yeah. I think Mitch was first.
Yeah, so looking at the diagram that you have here, I'm trying to understand the relationship to hairpinning. Is the ZTunnel handling encryption as it leaves shell client and then decryption as it gets to Gateway Istio? Or does Gateway Istio have to participate in that MTLS encryption?
Yeah, in this case, I have, so in the Istio waypoint model, the waypoint itself terminates the H-bone.
Right.
We had theorized the idea of what we called sandwich, where the waypoint was just a normal pod. It didn't handle encryption at all. And it would run on the node with ZTunnel, and ZTunnel would do it. The reason we never shipped that is because we couldn't come up with a good way to pass identity from ZTunnel to the gateway. I mean, we came up with ways, but we never, that was kind of the blocker. Like we didn't finalize it. So in this case, what I have is exactly that sandwich model. ZTunnel is terminating on the gateway Istio node. And that's why I said there was a limitation in this, that the gateway Istio can't really do client-aware policies. I mean, they could get the IP address maybe, but they would not get the identity from the TLS handshake, at least at this time. We could obviously add some enhancement to the ZTunnel, but even then it would probably be kind of a Istio-ish specific way, which we'd have to get added to other things. And
So-
one thing to note too is this encryption only works for in-cluster gateways. So we mentioned before, like, hey, you can stick an AWS load balancer here and it works fine. That's true, but you're not going to go stick ZTunnel on AWS load balancer. So this last part where we add the encryption only actually works for in-cluster ones.
That makes sense. So you've called this, you've mentioned it as like a design or a proposal, but it looks like it works already. So I don't understand what's being proposed.
Yeah, I'm not proposing anything. I'm really just trying to get some, share some understanding of like what waypoint is and isn't, and what you could do without waypoint. And to me, this kind of had a lot of light bulb moments as I was kind of going through this.
Okay.
And I'm like, it may result in a proposal eventually, as not yet.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, so you're not missing anything where I'm subtly like suggesting anything.
The proposal really, I mean, there's some proposal, John, implicit here, which is one to actually fix what we said about propagating his identity, make sure that we can do the identity delegations and some other things that previously we agreed, but we never prioritized, because this works, but there are some like corner cases and raffages.
Yeah, so this is very interesting to me. I'm intrigued by the idea of Istio, the project, looking to utilize the underlying platform as much as possible. I think that's the direction that things are going between Gateway API. I would like to see some more, not from you, John, or anybody in the Istio side, but in general, I think to get there, ideally we see some more collaboration on the CNI side as far as these capabilities, but that's neither really here nor there. I think that when you try to create, when you're experimenting and you're iterating quickly and you're looking to push something out there as a reference implementation, you can you find yourself in a situation where you've created a product and people use it. And I think that Ambient could very easily become that. I don't think well, I think Ambient will become that actually, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I do think that as we start thinking about the kind of Istio's positioning as a project and giving people the opportunity to use Gateway API and the network policy piece, where does the platform itself stop and where does Istio as a reference implementation continue? I just think it's interesting. Nothing really there. But I will say in the short term, I like the idea of keeping Istio as is kind of ecosystem wise, because I think there's a lot of innovation and speed that we can have as a community, as opposed to trying to wrangle multiple other ecosystems.
I love the idea of ecosystem play. I really like getting Istio to integrate with other technologies. That being said, this does sort of reminisce of the microservices to monolith transition that we made in 1.6. In that when you have an ecosystem play and you're heavily reliant on other things that are present in the ecosystem, you essentially begin putting the burden of dependency management and API version management on the user. When that's one or two pieces, that's pretty manageable. If it turns into 8 to 10 that are all mandatory for your mesh to even begin to function, it starts to look like a pretty unpleasant user experience. So I guess I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic about that direction, but we do need to there is a right size. Just pushing everything out into ecosystem is not the right answer.
Mitch, it's, yes, on the surface, but in reality, we put everything in one binary, but we added hooks, you can use other CAs, other whatever. And again, the whole idea was that we were managing all the pieces, and that's why, and it had the same security characteristics, same. That's why we could create a monolith in Istio. But in this case, it's a platform that we're integrating with, which is completely different and has completely different characteristics. So, it's not black and white with microservices versus monoliths. It's a very, specific decision about a lot of things.
On a related note, I think similar points also apply to the ZTunnel proxy implementation, because right now, the way it's positioned is that this is a very opinionated solution. This is a ZTunnel proxy. It only does MTLS, and that's the only model. But if we want to encourage alternate implementations of the ZTunnel proxy, which maybe take over more of the service load balancing or add fancier service load balancing or better integration with CNI, are we explicitly encouraging that, discouraging that? Or are we saying, no, if you want a compliant ambient implementation, your L4 proxy should be ZTunnel and ZTunnel only? I feel like it's not, this is a newcomer's view, so correct me if I'm off here, but it feels like completely opinionated that this is, ZTunnel is the one and only thing that you can do for your L4 proxy. Do we want to message, or whether it's a replaceable model at some point?
Yeah, I completely agree. This focus on waypoint, but I totally agree the same concern exists about ZTunnel, and that's something I've been thinking of a ton. And this actually, I think the link is probably very vague, but they are super related. One of the reasons that we claim that we have to do service in ZTunnel, which is what leads to 99% of the complexity in ZTunnel, right? Is that we need to know what service they wanted so that we can connect to the waypoint. In this model, that's no longer the case, because when I connect to Echo Mesh HowardJohn.net, it's not like the CNI is going to resolve that to a pod IP, right? So after it does all of its service resolution, network policy, logging, telemetry, whatever, the ZTunnel can get the packet and still forward it to the waypoint correctly. Whereas in today's model, if we were to attach a ZTunnel that late in the network path, we can't do waypoints at all because we have lost the service information. So this is one way to enable the CNI to do a lot of the things that ZTunnel does, or the CNI to continue doing a lot of things it does today instead of doing in ZTunnel. Potentially not the only way, but it is definitely one way. So I'm definitely considering that as well. I'm pretty concerned about us reinventing all of service in ZTunnel. Like it's a lot of complexity and work, especially when one of our goals is like to be 100% transparent and compatible. The easiest way to be 100% transparent and compatible is to not redo everything and let the platform do what it was doing before, right?
Agree. Just on that point, do we have an explicit statement here that the goal of ZTunnel is to leverage CNI wherever possible, or the goal would be eventually to bring in CNI-like functionality into the ZTunnel to minimize the variation of different CNIs? Like, do we have a position on yes, the intent of ZTunnel would be to maximize reuse of CNI capability?
I don't think we have that agreement yet. It's something that we could possibly get to, but that's certainly not the way the project has been going to date.
Right.
It's definitely an interesting goal. I don't want to say that I think that we should do it yet, but I'm definitely very, very interested in the idea.
But the goal remains to be 100% compatible and to not break in semantics or not have an application change behavior when we deploy Istio Ambient.
Right. That is a stated goal in the ambient documentation, but obviously we are not there at this point because we do some Kubernetes functionality doesn't work when you use ambient. And it's also
we could if we follow the path that, again, we can achieve the goal. It's not necessarily the goal to do it one way or another, but if we follow this model of not interfering and using network policy and so forth, then we'll be closer to the goal.
All right, we're a bit over time. Thank you, everybody, for the very good conversation. Looking forward to seeing where this continues to go. As always, if you got something else you want to talk about, please feel free to add it to the ambient agenda. With that, we'll close out today. Thanks, everybody.